Odd, unusual, and disturbing. Now, this protest was in a church, which seems to be the crux of the federal government's arguments. The Department of Homeland Security has told other news outlets that Don Lemon is being charged with conspiracy to deprive rights, violation of interfering with someone's First Amendment rights, i.e., the worshipers who were at this church. What does CPJ, what do you and your colleagues have to say about these charges? Are journalists allowed to go into places of worship in the middle of open services to do live interviews in the way that this happened? Or is it the fact that there was a protest that was entering that allowed for the journalistic coverage in that moment?
The journalists were following the news, right? And I think that's the important thing to note here, right? They were performing their work, right? It's and very much entitled, they were very much entitled to do so under the First Amendment, right? Which guarantees freedom of the press. We also have freedom of religion, right? And in no way was their reporting activity interfering with the church proceedings, right? The protest would have happened whether or not they were covering it or not, to our understanding. And so to conflate journalistic activity with something else is alarming and quite frankly shows a deep misunderstanding of the role that reporters play, which is informing the public about what's happening.
Now, Lemon at one point was wearing a beanie that looked like it identified his independent media outlet. But the two journalists that we're talking about here, Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, are independent journalists. And I know it's impossible to speculate that if they'd been with the AP or with Forbes or had been wearing large press vests, if this would have happened. But can you talk about whether or not the identification as someone as press would have made a difference in these scenarios?
It's difficult to say because, it's a kind of a post-factual, right? However, Don Lemon did identify himself as we said at the beginning, right, as a member of the press. And it doesn't really matter after the fact, right? Because the fact of the matter is the individuals who brought charges against these journalists very easily could have used Google to find out that they were in fact reporters. They chose not to do so, right? We're not talking about arrests that happened in on the spot in the moment when those types of confusions are more common. This arrest occurred after the protest had already concluded, and after two different judges had rejected the Justice Department's attempt to arrest Lemon and one of his producers, right? So the fact that, again, there was that much time to do proper research into who these individuals were really shows that the what I would say is attempt to silence speech versus to actually respect freedom of the press and journalists' ability to carry out their function.
You raise a good point, which is there had been an investigation almost immediately after the protest and Lemon's coverage of it. No charges were pressed then. Do we know what happened in the ensuing week to 10 days? Why now? Do we have a clear answer?
The Justice Department decided to ultimately pursue charges through a grand jury, right? Which is not a typical way of going about these types of arrests, again, especially of journalists. To go back to an earlier point, right? Anytime a journalist, in previous cases when journalists have been accused of trespassing on public property, that's usually handled at the state level. And instead, we have the federal government, a grand jury, in fact, involved in this, which is highly irregular. I hope that more information will come out soon about why this happened in this way, but it seems like the Justice Department failed to convince two other judges, both a federal magistrate judge and a federal appeals court judge, to move these charges forward.
Is this a politically motivated arrest?
Intent is difficult to ascribe always, but certainly the way the administration has framed this and their seeming lack of regard for regular legal proceedings and precedent as far as treatment of journalists goes certainly would indicate that this is highly irregular, abnormal, and should be deeply concerning, I think, to see so many legal processes and which have been put into place for a reason to protect civil liberties, to see all of those ignored.